So over the last couple of years, we've seen inflation take a hit on our economy. Gas prices have gone above $4 a gallon. And even some parts of the country, it's hit $7 a gallon. In fact, it's even affected on if we're going to go to McDonald's to just grab a basic cheeseburger and fries. In fact, earlier this year, McDonald's realized that the people who make less than $45,000 a year no longer buy food from the restaurants because it's now too expensive. In fact, I even remember as a child going to McDonald's and seeing the dollar menu. That was great for my family. Now, a family of five, no, sure, normally it costs a pretty penny, but going to McDonald's, you can feed an entire family for less than 30 bucks. Well, nowadays, McDonald's, 30 bucks can maybe feed Marjorie and I, and that's it. We've seen crazy prices just skyrocket, and it's not just with restaurants, it's with grocery stores. It's even just with a dozen eggs is almost $2. It becomes difficult sometimes to just even live life, just to meet the basic needs of our family. And with all these crazy prices, Marjorie and I have had to sit down and evaluate our house budgets and even sometimes reevaluate. Today, we're going to be looking at a time where people in Jerusalem went through difficulties of even providing for their family, on trying to figure out what to do, on how to just buy grain to make bread for their families. We're going to be looking at Nehemiah chapter 5 and all the struggles we see inside of the walls of Jerusalem. So last week, we looked at all the struggles that were happening more outside of the walls, all the struggles that people in Jerusalem had because of the people outside of the walls. But now we're going to be seeing more what's going on inside of the walls of Jerusalem. So the first point we see in the first 5 verses of Nehemiah chapter 5, we see the struggles of the people. That's our first point. Verses 1 through 5, we see the struggles of the people. So I'm going to read that right here for us. Again, this is verses 1 through 5 in Nehemiah chapter 5, which says, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our field and our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine.' Still others were saying, 'We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards.' Verse 5, 'Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our own countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others.'" So, in the first few verses, we see several struggles that are going on within the walls of Jerusalem. First one is that there is a food shortage. Now, what's been going on right now is that the work of the wall has been going well, as we talked about last week, how the walls of Jerusalem, they're going well, good progress and everything. But the progress on the wall there's been so much focus on the walls that sometimes people don't have time to work at their fields, their vineyards, that they can take that to market and, well, they can sell that to make money, to provide for their families, or even just make make grain for themselves. And so because of that, there became a food shortage, or as we see here, a famine. People are starving, people are just hungry, they're trying to just get as much food as they can to just simply survive. And so, because of that, because of the famine, because of this food shortage, that was the first problem. Then we go into the second problem, which was people had to mortgage their homes, vineyards, and fields just to buy food, to get grain. But because of that, because they were selling off all their ways to make money, yes, they had food in their stomachs, they were able to eat, which was good. But then the next problem came to be is that, well, they had to then borrow money in order to pay the king's taxes. The king, remember, currently Jerusalem is underneath the rule of Persia, King Artaxerxes, which we saw him in chapters 1 and 2. And so people had to borrow money in order to pay the king's tax. So that was the third problem. And then on top of all of that, they had to pay back their lenders with something. Well, think about this. You have no home, you have no collateral, no field to make money, you have no vineyard, you have no house. How are you going to pay your lenders? They can only pay with the one thing that they have left, their children, selling them into slavery. That was it. Now, slavery during biblical times is very different from the American Civil War. As we all know, that was very cruel and terrible time. But here, slavery, it's a time where sometimes people put themselves into slavery because it's a lot better than being homeless, because maybe you can get maybe 2 to 3 meals a day, you get clothes, a bed, a roof over your head. So in a way, being a slave was almost even being better than homeless. And maybe the parents of these children were saying, you know what? We have to pay off our debts some way. And maybe our children might be able to get some food in their bellies while they're enslaved. But what makes matters worse with all of this is that the people that these unfortunate people are dealing with, they're not strangers, they're not from faraway lands. They're dealing with their own countrymen, their fellow Jewish brothers. In fact, we see this in verse 5. It says, although we are of the same flesh and blood as our own countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. That's how difficult it got to that point. Now, I do want to put everyone at ease. For Marjorie and I, we're not at that point, obviously. We're not, yes, it is tough, but we're not at the point where we have to sell little Hadassah. We're nowhere close to that point. So it's okay. Little Hattie is safe. And even if we get to that point, we'll never sell her. But that was the struggles of the time. The struggles of just trying to provide for their families, that they have no choice but to sell their children into slavery. And then with our second point, we see the appeal for the people. This is verses 6 through 13. It starts off with Nehemiah hearing the news. And We start off in verse 6. It says, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I'm just going to stop there at that point. Nehemiah was very angry at this. Because people at this time, they're almost forgetting about what was the point that they had, like the point of like what they were doing. They were supposed to focus on themselves in a way, not as a selfish way, but protecting themselves, building the wall to make their city a flourishing city, a healthy city. But Nehemiah find out is that Jews are taking advantage of other Jews. He gets angry with this. Now, some people have asked, why did Nehemiah focus on this problem sooner? If it was happening, why didn't Nehemiah do anything? Did he just ignore it? Did he just say, nah, who cares about that? I'll take care of it at a different time. Maybe because he was just so focused on rebuilding the wall, focusing on what the people needed, that he didn't know about all this other stuff going on. Now, remember, in the last chapter, we found out that Nehemiah was getting ready for a potential attack that could happen literally at any moment, day or night. In fact, in chapter 4, we saw that Nehemiah and his brothers didn't even change their clothes. They always had a sword with them, some type of weapon with them, just in case there was going to be an attack. So maybe he was so focused on that that he didn't even know about everything else that was going on. But here we see that he finds out about this problem. Now, after he finds out, yes, we see Nehemiah was angry, but then we see his initial reaction in verse 7, which says, I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. So at the beginning of verse 7, I'm just going to stop there really quick. So he finds out of what was going on with the people in Jerusalem, that Jews are taking advantage of other Jews, and he gets so upset. He's angry and upset. But instead of going to the officials and the nobles all angry and focused on his emotions, he takes a moment, he calms down, he relaxes, and then he talks to the nobles and officials. Because remember, at the beginning of verse 7, I pondered them in my mind, as in, I'm not going to go and start yelling at people because I'm upset, I am angry, I am outraged of what's going on, but I'm not going to let my emotions run away. I'm not going to let the anger rule my decision making. So before talking with the nobles and officials, he relaxed, he pondered on what to say and what to do, and then talked to them. And so we picked up in the middle of verse 7, which says, I told them, are you exacting usury from your own countrymen? Now, usury is like interest or collateral. And continuing on. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us? They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So what was happening is that with Nehemiah coming back to Jerusalem, he and like his leadership were working on bringing the community back together, bringing the people who were enslaved, the Jews who were enslaved, back to Jerusalem, bringing back together as a community to work together. But then this whole chain of events where then people were selling their children into slavery, and then it's just like kind of like that really bad cycle again. And it's just like, wait a second, guys, you are undoing what we've been working on. for so long. Why are you doing this? And at the end of verse 8, we see the reactions of the nobles and officials, which is what? They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. Now, there's two thoughts about this. Maybe the first one is maybe these officials and the nobles, they were thinking, maybe they thought what they were doing was wrong, but they just did it anyway. Because it's like, well, I want to get rich. They were focused more on that than just being right. The second one is maybe they never thought of it like that. They never thought about, like, oh, I'm taking advantage of my own countrymen. I'm just looking to make money. But then maybe they realized, oh, maybe what we're doing is actually wrong. But now, in either case, whether they knew what they were doing was wrong or not, it's it's like, yeah, we can't rebuttal, we can't say anything in response. In verse 9, they continued. It says, so I continued, what are you doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? So now people are probably sometimes leaders, they say certain things, maybe in almost like in a way like a riddle. You know what I'm saying? It's like, what are you trying to say? Are you saying I'm wrong? I'm right? Am I doing good? Am I doing bad? Nehemiah just straight up says it. What are you doing? What you are doing is not right. Just point blank. Just clear, cut, and dry. It's what you are doing is not right. We pick up again in verse 10. I and my brothers and my men are also leading the people or lending the people money and grain, but let the exacting of usury stop. Again, usury is like interest or collateral. Verse 11, give back to them immediately their fields and vineyards, olive groves and houses, and also the usury you are charging them. The 100th part of the money, grain, new wine, and oil. Verse 12, we will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. So we see that the nobles realized, yeah, what we're doing is wrong. They couldn't say anything in response because they realized, yeah, we're doing stuff wrong here. So we'll just give it back. We'll give it back to them and we won't seek any more money. We won't seek any more profit. We'll do as you say, Nehemiah. And so continuing on in verse 12, then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. Verse 13, I also shook out the folds of my robes and said, in this way, may God shake out of his house and possessions every man who does not keep his promise. So may such a man be shaken out and emptied. At this, the whole assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised. So the people were starting to truly understand here. We're not here to make a profit. That's not our main goal here. Our main goal is to work together. We're supposed to be together. We are supposed to rebuild these walls. That's not our purpose here. And instead of rebuttaling, they decided to give everything back just as they had promised. And then finally, our third and final point, we see the example for the people. But this is verses 14 through 19. This takes us to the rest of Nehemiah chapter 5. And so in Nehemiah chapter 5, starting in verse 14, it says, "Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor." Now I'm just going to stop right there for now. We see in this section here, we see Nehemiah. We see his true example as the type of leader he wanted to be for the people of Jerusalem. You see, Nehemiah was not like all the other governors. In fact, we see this in verse 15. "But the earlier governors, those preceded me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition of the food and wine." So Nehemiah didn't want to be like the previous governors. He didn't want to be like the previous leaders. He wanted to be something different. And so one of the things he did was he did not take any of the food that was allotted for the governors. Now, this type of food that we see as a description here, it's most likely the choice food, like the best food. This would be the stuff that would be used for entertaining, like entertainment for guests, for other rulers, for neighboring nations. But Nehemiah said, "No, we're not taking this." In fact, in verse 17, we see that he actually gives it to the people. He focuses more on giving it to the people. Also, we see that Nehemiah doesn't take any money from the people. So continuing on in verse 15. So talking about how the previous governors took 40 shekels of silver as well as their food and possessions. But then at the end of verse 15, their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of the reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. So Nehemiah said, "Hey, we're just focused here on the wall. We're not here to focus on getting money. We're not here to focus on getting stuff from the people like all the other governors. We had a task. We're here to do it." And friends, earlier in this section, we saw that he had been doing this for 12 years. So friends, remember this construction project, it wasn't exactly a simple task. It wasn't exactly like a week-long project. Now, yes, the wall might have taken some time, but it's not just the rebuilding of the wall itself that Nehemiah was focused on. He was focused on the people, on what they needed. And continuing on in verse 18, it says, "Each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me. And every 10 days, the abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people." So, friends, Nehemiah just, again, he said, like, "Hey, this is all for you guys. I'm not taking this food. This is for the people. Let them eat. Let them have the food. They're the ones starving." He was just focused on the wall and what they needed. See, he wasn't focused on the glory from the people. He wasn't focused on the riches like the previous governors. The previous governors probably just focused on wealth, glory, fame. But he's coming in, Nehemiah comes in and just says, "Hey guys, we're going to do some stuff on the wall today. We're going to be focusing on rebuilding the city." And everyone was like, "What? What? This is different. We've never seen this before." See, Nehemiah was different because he didn't focus on what was expected as the governor. He focused on what the people needed. In verse 19, Nehemiah closes this chapter by saying, "Remember me with favor, oh my God, for all I have done for these people." As we say again, he didn't focus on himself. He didn't focus on his own glory. He focused on what the people needed, which then goes into our application today. We see three things. The first one is, even in difficult times, do not stop worshiping God. And friends, I've talked about how following Christ is not easy. It's very difficult. And I've talked about that in the ways of sometimes people in the community just say, no, you're a Christian. You're one of those God people. I don't want to follow you. But friends, there's so much more than just the community side. There's also just living life. There's difficulty. We looked at how the people of Jerusalem were struggling just to get food for their family, for their children. Had to mortgage their house, had to mortgage their fields, their vineyards, everything they own just to get some bread. Had to borrow money just to pay the taxes. And because they couldn't pay the taxes, they had to sell their children. And so, even in difficult times, do not stop worshiping God. Which, friends, if you remember from last week, how we talked about when life is going well, when following Christ is going good, watch out. The devil is about to attack. And so, in these difficult times, in these times of struggle, don't give in to hatred, don't give in to anger, frustration, but continue to worship God. The second thing we see is care for fellow Christians. Care for fellow Christians. Here we saw Jews taking advantage of other Jews. And because of this, Nehemiah got angry. He got upset. Which actually, when I was studying this reminded me about when Jesus walked into the temple and he's seen all all this, like kind of like a marketplace. He's seen Jews taking advantage of other Jews during a time where they were required to make sacrifices. You see, if people were going to make a sacrifice, particularly like during Passover, they couldn't just bring their sacrificial lamb with them or any other sacrificial animals with them on their trip. Like if they're coming from Africa, that's a long trip. And so they just said, hey, we'll just buy them in Jerusalem. But then the people selling these animals are like, hey, I can make a little extra money off this. And I'm not talking about raising the prices. It's like, oh, I'll add like an extra dollar or two. They would add like 5 times the price. And so then what does Jesus do? He goes through the temple, flips over the money tables because he was so angry. People were forgetting about the point of the temple, the point of why people are coming here to worship God. Now, am I saying we should start doing that? Start going to different places and start flipping over the cashier registers or the different money tables? No, I'm not saying that at all. Going back to the whole point of care for fellow Christians, if there's a fellow believer in Christ who needs help them out. Now, I'm not saying write a check for $1,000, but if it's just buying some food, make them a casserole. Give them some gas money to get to work. But care for fellow Christians. And then finally, this last application point is more of a for a leadership perspective, a leadership application. Focus on what is needed, not what is expected. People expected Nehemiah to be like all the other governors. Just come in, take their money, take their food, just leave them to die, to leave them to just roam the streets in all the rubble the city walls were in. But instead of that, Nehemiah didn't focus on the fame and the glory of being governor. He focused on what the people needed, on what Jerusalem needed. He encouraged the people to come together, to work together. To help bring them back to a healthy city. Now, Nehemiah, he did have the opportunity to take the choice food, to take the fame, the glory, all the money, but he didn't. Instead, he focused on what the people needed. And that's what we should be doing as Christians. We shouldn't be focused on what people expect us to do, but we should do what is needed. Let us pray.